Hi, welcome back to Women of Priesthood. I am Rachel Patterson. Thank you guys for coming back. This is my channel where we have taken on President Russell M. Nelson's challenge to study all we can about priesthood power. And I don't know if you guys know this. This is something that I probably didn't fully appreciate until I had grown up, but I actually grew up in the same town, county, township as Joseph Smith was born in Vermont. My mother and father were both like 10th generation Vermonters. I don't even know. They both joined the church in northern Vermont and then moved a little bit south to raise me and my sisters. And we were in the town that was right in between where Joseph Smith was born and then where his leg operation was. And we were just south of Dartmouth College, which was where Dr. Nathan Smith, who had operated on Joseph Smith's leg, was from. So I got to get a very interesting preview into the early formative culture that would have had an impression on him. And I can see a lot of through lines between how that culture would have impacted him. And I also, when I look at Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, they both make total sense to me. When you look at it from that kind of a perspective of like a New Englander lens, they make total sense to me. And so I wanted to offer some of those perspectives to you. A couple of my friends had said, you know, you have this really amazing testimony of Joseph Smith. I wish I had that. I took for granted that I've always had a testimony of the prophet Joseph. Sharon, Vermont, where he was born, this circle on the map, is also the site where the Joseph Smith Memorial is. The church has restored it. They've made a girls' camp. And I've had some of the most beautiful spiritual experiences of my life at this space. This land, they say, is guarded by angels, and I believe it. It's so sacred. It's so still. It's quiet. We didn't have a temple near to us. The closest temple was Washington, D.C., and then they built a Boston temple when I was about 15. But I would go to the Joseph Smith Memorial if I ever needed to think about something or I needed to spiritually meditate on something. It's a really powerful, peaceful place, and what a quiet, uninterrupted place to gain a testimony of the prophet Joseph. Interestingly enough, of the original 19 Quorum of the 12 Apostles members, if you're including Joseph Smith as the president, I'm including him, 8 of them were from Vermont and New Hampshire. So number 20, Ezra Taft Benson, was kind of the first wave of early church leaders who would have been born in Idaho. So up to that point, you have people from New York, from Connecticut, from New Hampshire, but there's a lot of them from Vermont. And when I look at Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, one of the things that I see in them is this total unwillingness to change who they are to win the approval of other people. Vermonters, New Hampshire people, maniacs as we call them, we are just completely unwilling to change who we are innately or what we think innately in order to win someone's praise. It's just not in us. There's almost no plastic surgery in this area because I think my aunt once said, well, why would I do that? Like, it's still going to be my face underneath. There's just this loyalty to what you believe and what you think. And one of my friends, actually, he's from Maine. He visited Vermont. He came and looked at me. He's like, they are the weirdest version of they are like the most unique version of libertarians that I've ever met in my life. And I was like, that is so right. That is exactly what it's the weirdest version of libertarian that you've ever met. They are independent spirited. They are resilient to any kind of outside external pressure. They decide what they think, and that's what they think, and they're convicted. And Joseph Smith and Brigham Young both had that. But what I like about knowing so much about how human Joseph Smith was is that you can see how the hand of God used him and used Brigham Young in different ways, even though they were totally different men. The Lord uses them for his purposes. This is a picture of where the leg operation would have happened. So just backing up. So Sharon, Vermont's where he's born. You follow down Route 89 and you cross the river into New Hampshire and you come over here into Lebanon. That picture I just showed you. And that's where his operation would have happened. That's probably a 30-40 minute drive. And then I grew up here, right on the border of Vermont and New Hampshire. This star up here in Norwich is where I ended up going to grad school at Dartmouth, and I eloped in Norwich, which is where Joseph Smith would have spent a little bit of time after Lebanon, and it was from Norwich that they would have gone to Palmyra. So Dartmouth is right here in Hanover, and that has a pretty the effect, the cultural influence that Dartmouth and an Ivy League school and academia, and it was originally established as a religious seminary to convert the local Native American tribes. So not only was Joseph Smith raised in a community and a culture that lives, breathes, and eats academia, like it was a very stressful, ambitious place to grow up. Because academics are everything and getting into a good college was everything. But back when he was growing up, it would have been a religious seminary, a religious education would have been really stressed. So how much more audacious was he when he decided to organize a religion and had no religious education? That's something that I don't know, as we mentioned, we'd like, oh, he wasn't literate. Yeah, he also he didn't go to seminary. These were all religious PhDs, essentially, that he would have grown up near. Okay. This is a portrait of his early operation, which would have happened right here by the pet store. We were very excited when that pet store went in. It was a big deal. This is our little home ward. Move it out of the way. It's beautiful. Such a great little place to grow up. And it was a great place to grow up. I loved it. And we had wonderful members of the church who would come from out west to the medical school there. And as a result, I got a lot of exposure to really intellectual people in the ward, faithful intellectual people, but also some people whose intellect kind of got in the way of them having strong testimonies or what have you. I kind of saw how genius could actually be a hindrance as opposed to an advantage. So one of the things Joseph Smith said was, in Joseph Smith History 110, he reflects back and says, "In the midst of this war of words and tumult of opinions, I often said to myself, what is to be done? Who of all these parties are right, or are they all wrong together?" So you can see in this paragraph that he is trying to make an argument in his own mind. And when you're in that kind of a culture and that kind of an area or community, you are exposed to people who are smarter than you, who are more well-trained than you, who are more articulate than you. And so it's almost, they will talk circles around you. You will never be able to win an argument with people this smart. But the problem is that a war of words and a tumult of opinions, war and tumult suggests chaos and confusion. And his argument, and I think one of the things he learned from these early formative years of deferring his authority to experts, to academics, is that even if they're confidently speaking about something that isn't true, it's still not true. And the way that no matter how smart they are, and the way that you can tell is that it's very confusing. It's war of words and tumult of opinions. It was clearly a very academically and emotionally and psychologically chaotic experience for him to be around such smart people who could talk circles around him, and yet they still didn't make any sense, especially when he had been exposed to incredibly pure truth by God the Father and Jesus Christ. He said, "I was answered that I must join none of them, for they were all wrong, and the personage who addressed me said that all their creeds were an abomination in his sight, for those professors were all corrupt. They teach for doctrines the commandments of men." I find this very interesting. Because in this culture, New England culture, professors, academics have a very high level. There's almost like a religious reverence. We've joked about it in my family because New England has a very low religiosity rate right now. Like it's the lowest attending church service people in the country. Is Vermont and New Hampshire. They attend church the least, but they have their own religion and it's academia. And the professors he mentions were all corrupt. And that would have been a bit of a rude awakening for him that I'm sure came over time, because when he was growing up, there was an enormous amount of respect and deference paid to men who'd gone to a religious seminary, who'd gone to religious training. Who would you, a common man, be to question men with actual academic scholarship in religion? But what he finds is that after all of the emotional torture they put him through from the age of 14 on, what he concludes in adulthood is that they were all wrong anyway. They were professors, but they were all wrong. And just because they were incredibly smart and well-trained didn't mean that they weren't vulnerable to placating audiences for praise. They teach for doctrines the commandments of men. He's meaning that these professors of religion were corrupt because they were changing doctrine to fit a narrative that would please their audience. Does that sound at all familiar to anyone with what's going on right now? BYU, anyone? Like, there's so much of that going on. And what I like about the Joseph Smith story is this idea that don't give your internal authority away to anyone, even if they have 3 initials behind their name. You learn the doctrine for yourself. Search the doctrine for yourself. And if someone is saying, using some kind of a credential to diminish what you know as true, you should follow Joseph Smith's kind of lesson and see that as suspect, because truth should stand on its own 2 feet, right? And he states later that he really has an integrity to himself and would never change what he believed to win praise and approval. He says, in Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith, he says, "It mattereth not whether the principle is popular or unpopular. I will always maintain a true principle, even if I stand alone in it." And that is where he and Brigham Young are very similar. What I mentioned earlier was this kind of independent spirit, this total unwillingness to capitulate to other people's expectations of you to make them like you. And that is where I think Joseph Smith and Brigham Young excelled, is they were independent of the good opinion of others. They were independent of the praise of the academic establishment and the experts of religion. And that, in turn, opened up his aperture to be able to be teachable by God. And you really see that in the King Follett Discourse, which I quoted at the very beginning of the slide deck. I also think that when he read 2 Nephi 9:28, I wonder if it hit him really hard, because I grew up in an area where I was like that Upper Valley has the smartest people in the world. And yet I saw people who could not have faith because they were so smart. And I saw that they were making really bad choices about their families because they were so smart and so full of their own, I don't know, ego or whatnot. But 2 Nephi 9:28, "Oh, the cunning plan of the evil one, oh, the vainness and the frailties and the foolishness of men. When they are learned, they think they are wise, and they hearken not unto the counsel of God. For they set it aside, supposing they know of themselves, wherefore their wisdom is foolishness, and it profiteth them nothing." And I have seen this, "Oh, the vainness and frailties and foolishness of men, when they are learned, they think they are wise." There is we are so vulnerable to conflating education with being wise. We are so vulnerable to that now. Education is not a 1-for-1 for wisdom, and education and academics, academia does not equate truth. And Joseph Smith learned that in a very difficult way, because he had to be gaslit for basically a decade by the experts of religion before he figured out it doesn't matter that you studied all this, you still don't have the truth. You have man's perception of truth, but it's so far off. And he concludes in this, he really gets into this almost joyful independent spirit, right? He says, "The best way to obtain truth and wisdom is not to ask from books, but to go to God in prayer and obtain divine teaching," which I love, because he was scholarly. We know that he was teaching himself multiple languages, but it sounds like he was seeking divine learning first, divinely inspired learning first, and he was seeking truth first. This is from the King Follett Discourse, and I love this quote. He says, "I will prove that the world is wrong by showing what God is." And I just think that's the most gutsy, audacious, bold thing to say, that he would say. He would get to the point where he was so independent of the good opinion of the establishment, of academics, of religious seminaries, that he would turn the religious world on its head with the doctrines that would be revealed to him, and that he would be so willing to be teachable and accept what God had to teach him. So that's my little anecdote for now about some of the things that I feel like I learned growing up in the Upper Valley, growing up where he would have been a younger child, a young man, and some of those cultural effects filter down into New York. I wanted to show you in this map. We would drive from, we would basically, when we drove to Palmyra, we did the Joseph Smith Trail, right? We would go from Norwich to Palmyra and along the Finger Lakes. It's got to be one of the prettiest places in America, I still think. It's just absolutely stunning in the summer. But right where this little circle is right here, over by Palmyra, what happened? I lost my, that is where Seneca Falls is, which is where the first women's suffragette movement happened. And so I remember thinking as a girl, a teenager, like, man, there was something in the water here, that all of this renaissance of religion and rights and, you know, civil rights and the restoration all happened here. Like, what was going on in this area at this time? So I want to close by leaving you my testimony that I know that I believe that Joseph Smith was a prophet. I believe that he was a very literal human man. He was not Santa Claus, or he was not an extraordinary human. He was a human. I mean, I think he was extraordinary in some of his qualities, where I think he was truly earnest and a true seeker of truth. And that's why I do love the King Follett Discourse, because it shows his personality and his desire to know truth. But he was also human. And so when he made mistakes with like the banking project he set up in Nauvoo that failed and people lost their money, he was a human. He was truly a human being. And that we don't need to hold that in conflict with him being a prophet of God. If anything, it should show us that God really can do wonders and do miracles with any man that he chooses. Well, I don't know, any willing man. And in this case, he chose and set aside Joseph Smith, and we're so grateful that he was able to make the sacrifices he did. Okay, so if you liked this, please share it with a friend. That's the best way for us to just grow. And I look forward to talking with you guys more. Thanks for sticking with me. You guys are awesome. Bye.
The restoration of the priesthood is just as relevant to you as a woman